So we believe that it would be wonderful if we did live in an idealistic world where there aren't any structural barriers and only hardworking merit. However, this is simply not the case. As side government, our stance is that we maintain that the American dream is unrealistic and only further discourages minorities in the long term. So in the status quo, two things are occurring. First of all, minorities are buoyed by false hopes. So the American dream was created when there was an outburst of opportunities, when there was an increase in employment and openings for jobs, which is clearly not the case in the current status quo. And aside from this, as minorities want to belong in society, they want to gain blue collar or white collar status to reduce discrimination. And this is also the view most popularized by the American dream, as they believe these jobs will lead to social mobility. And therefore, this success itself is very narrowly defined, as will further expand in our second substantive. And there's also obviously a discrimination, of course, because of like obvious prejudices against these minorities themselves. For example, against Blacks, against Asian people, and against Hispanic people, and all these other different communities of minorities. And so, in our model, we believe in we would like to enforce two things. First of all, we would no longer emphasize the hard work lead to success automatically narrative, as to eliminate the emphasis on work will immediately translate to success. Secondly, we will continue to provide subsidies for minorities, including quotas, financial aid, and etc. that already exist in that status quo, but we'll also try to amplify them and also increase awareness and also try to increase these other policies as well. And we believe that this will result in two things instead in our alternative. So first of all, there's like less burden for minorities to reach for a very homogenous and often limited view, as success itself is often very defined very narrowly in the status quo. Secondly, it does not provide a delusional narrative that claims that your natural abilities and your effort will culminate to automatically lead to success, despite the fact, as mentioned before, you're obviously going to be discriminated against because of the qualities that make you belong in that specific type of minority, and etc. So what happens on our side is that we actually enable these minorities to succeed. We actually enable this alternative where we are able to achieve our goal of more minorities succeeding economically. So moving on directly to our first substantive on how this American dream itself is very unrealistic and therefore harmful. Why is this the case? Two reasons. First of all, upward mobility by itself is heavily deterred by policies strictly enforced by different actors. For example, the state, societal ideals, corporations, etc., and so many other actors. So even if the majority in the current status quo struggle to make ends meet, as these opportunities are given to you by traditional means. For example, the way like upper mobility normally works is you get a college degree, you get a good job, and etc. However, this creates a system where only the privileged members of the majority are able to succeed. Therefore, this upward mobility by itself is extremely hard for anyone, but especially is more comfortable for these majorities to achieve instead. Secondly, there's obviously the discrimination against minorities. So in the status quo, certain disadvantages already exist that are particular to these specific minorities. This includes lower pay, less likely to be employed, structural barriers, social prejudices that always culminate in, for example, there's to these employers or specifically the social workers or other sort of discrimination that can happen, for example, hate crimes and all these other discrimination, all this discrimination and social prejudices that currently occur in the status quo against minorities simply because they're different, simply because they have a different color of their skin and etc. However, the American dream disregards that because it's built specifically for the majority and it only like enables upward social mobility for those who can actually access success under the American dream, under this highly idealized version and narrative of success. So what are the very impacts of this that makes it so harmful? So there are two things. First of all, the actual pressure on minorities to succeed, because this narrative only encourages you to think that, oh, if I do put in this hard work, then I will succeed and I will be recognized by meritocracy, etc. However, this ties with the homogenous and singular view of success. So white collar and blue collar jobs, although they might not be the best way to achieve their dreams, I'll take you later, will be the ones that are clearly defined. And therefore, there's more pressure on minorities to succeed. So what happens is they continue to work hard, despite the fact that, first of all, this view of success is very limited. Secondly, there are already so many structural barriers that stop them from succeeding in this way. And therefore, this only culminates in extreme pressure for these minorities to succeed in this particular way that could very well be futile. Secondly, there's still further discouragement of minorities. So when they realize that their dreams are highly unachievable, they only recognize two things. First of all, this meritocracy, again mentioned before, is extremely hard to achieve in status quo, as the American dream itself is false. And thus, this only leads to an actual lack of motivation. So what does this mean? These minorities can no longer believe they can succeed because you're still instilling dreams of success and automatic happiness when you work hard. So even if they start to fail, then they won't actually be motivated to, succeed even more because they realize that this dream is either false or they continue working without realizing that this is actually instilling a sense of delusion and falseness through the American dream. So before I move on, I'll take a POI. If there are none, then I'll just go on.
Are going to tell minorities that no matter how hard you try, you can't really escape your social class?
Could you repeat that again for me?
So are you going to tell minorities instead that no matter how hard you try, you can't really escape?
Okay, so we've already established the fact that there is a very delusion that this is a very delusional narrative, that this American dream itself only leads to a very trapped version of success, where you have minorities who have to face these structural barriers such as discrimination instead. And so we believe that rather than telling them delusional tales about how, oh, you can automatically achieve success when you achieve hard work, again, as you mentioned before, we're already going to amplify policies such as affirmative action and also all these more like all these other policies that are more specifically geared towards helping minorities instead of instilling false hopes and dreams that are only based on a very homogenous view of success that can only really work for the majority, since the minorities are already being discriminated against so much. And we believe that this answers your point. Moving on directly to our second substantive on how this limits the outlook of minorities. So the impact of the American dream to minorities will make people think that they will succeed with hard work. Two scenarios happen. First of all, you won't really seek what the individual wants in the first place. After all, the American dream makes individuals pursue success, which often means suburban stability. So even if you succeed, there's only a very small percentage due to, as what you have proven in the first substantive, it's still beneficial for minorities despite the modicum of success and middle class stability. So even if assuming that this is the kind of success you want. Secondly, however, if the minority fails to do this, they only get to blame themselves, that you're the odd one out. And it will be less likely for them to reach out for help because they will only think that they deserve failure. And their own failure is not something you can blame to society or blame the state or society for. However, this is clearly not the case because these minorities are already structurally discriminated against. And therefore, what we only succeed in doing is instilling these false hopes and narratives and only leading them to blame themselves instead, which we believe is and we believe that our alternative is far better, where we actually create this sort of narrative for minorities to succeed by themselves instead of creating this singular narrative about how meritocracy will automatically lead you to success. Society also is impacted by this narrative. They will think that the reason why minorities are poor is because they don't have much abilities, that it's the minority's individual problem. And therefore, society will think that there's less need and responsibility for them to provide services and works to greater lives of minorities, specifically because the American dream dictates that this will be that like meritocracy will still persist. And this leads to two things. First of all, less likely for minorities to receive help and services. Secondly, success would only likely happen for specific privileged minorities who do have abilities. And there are even more impacts to this. So for example, people won't actually look for minority services, despite the fact that social barriers are the ones that cause this discrimination or initial failure of these minorities. And therefore, it just results in less advantages for minorities that we are at least able to stop in the under our role. So what do we provide? We provide a realistic option which is much needed under the current status quo, minority-specific support that doesn't further damage motivation and prospects by instilling false narratives, and therefore we are very proud to propose.
Let opening opposition be clear. We don't care if the hope is false, even if we just give them the illusion of hope, insofar as it makes the future for minorities better practically and improve their quality of life, we're fine with that. 3 points of framing to just clarify all the mess that Eojin made. First of all, the motion says quote unquote own version of success. So it doesn't have to be getting super rich and earning a lot of money. We agree that that is unrealistic for a lot of minorities. People set up different standards and visions depending on their circumstances. And I think that minorities are rational enough to actually set up goals that they are able to achieve. Second of all, perfection is not the goal that we want to achieve, right? If minorities can be benefited by believing in the American dream, I think that we are fine with that, which means that we don't really care if the American dream is true or false. Obviously, we are going to tell you why the American dream is being true for more and more minorities as time passes. We always tell you as to why, even if that is not true, if minorities do believe in the American dream, it is better for them. Finally, I just want to note that all of opening government's model just doesn't make sense. First of all, I don't know why it is exclusive to their case, but second of all, their model is precisely helping minorities to achieve the American dream easier. So I don't really know why they propose all of those things when they are rejecting the narrative of the American dream. Two substantives coming from opening opposition. First of all, how this improves the quality of life of minorities and thus them climb up the social ladder. Second of all, about motivation and how this provides them a sense of hope, even if that is false, why that is beneficial. First of all, why does this improve the quality of life of minorities? I just want to clarify that we have seen a trend of social success being more open to more and more minorities, right? This debate is not about the 1920s when Lenny was shot by George because they thought that the American dream was not attainable. Minorities can climb up the social ladder, and that is only possible when they want to climb up the social ladder. They're only possible to climb up the social ladder when they're strongly motivated to do so. If minorities do not believe that they can work hard to climb up the social ladder, then I think that the cycle of discrimination will continue on forever, right? The most effective way to make a more equal society is to enable minorities to stand up for themselves, right? That is why we just want to co-opt all of OG's model, because we're able to just support minorities actually achieve the American dream easier, to actually let more minorities break through the structural barriers that have existed in the United States. Obviously, we do agree that it takes a long time to rid the world of the structural discrimination that has existed. But we have already seen a lot of progress, and the progress was possible because people tried hard. For example, if I am born from a poor family and I work really hard and escape poverty to a certain extent, then I can let my own children grow under better circumstances than I did. That is a cycle that has been continuing for quite a long time, making more and more minorities able to escape the poverty cycle, able to climb up the social ladder to a certain extent. On legislative change, the fact that many minorities believe in the American dream is precisely the reason as to why they constantly demand for legislative change. All the changes that opening government want to make, for example, more quotas and affirmative action, those changes were demanded because people realized that there were structural barriers, and at the same time, they wanted to achieve the American dream. That is why people protested for those changes. That is why people demanded the government to make those kinds of changes to break through the structural barriers in the very first place to make the American dream more realistic. I just don't know why opening government proposes such a model when their model in and of itself is instrumental to make minorities achieve the American dream easier, right? Advocacy for legislative change only happens when people are aware of the fact that they should get rid of discrimination, right? If minorities do not try their best to climb up the social ladder, there is a lower level of urgency, there's a lower level of awareness amongst minorities to solve these structural barriers and demand change to break through those structural barriers. In on our side of the house, even though some minorities might face like structural discrimination, we're the side that actually lets them demand for changes. We're the side that actually motivates society to break through those barriers. Finally, on role models, and I'll TPY later. There are some minorities that do end up achieving social success, right? For example, like Obama was the first African American to be the US president. The current vice president is of mixed Asian American and African American, right? I agree that that is only a few cases, but they are role models to, for example, young minorities and their communities. And they also do play a crucial role in getting rid of discrimination, right? If some minorities are able to achieve social success and become influential people in society, they're the ones that are capable, for example, like working to like get rid of discrimination, get rid of like the structural barriers that exist for minorities, actually, for example, show people as to how minorities are also able to succeed. So I think that all of those benefits is at best, much harder for opening government and like just government as a whole to achieve when less minorities are actually motivated to work hard. Yeah, PY.
Do you think it is fair for privileged people to create a system where the vast majority of minorities cannot succeed, and when they inevitably fail, blame their failure on them instead of the discriminatory system?
First of all, I don't really think that minorities are going to take that in the first place, right? In the status quo, again, as I told you, minorities know that structural barriers exist, and they in fact blame the social system that actually, for example, has social barriers. That is like basically the analysis that I gave you as to why there are demands for social change. Second of all, I don't really think that like a lot of minorities are going to inevitably fail, right? I already clarified at the top of my speech as to why the standards for success is different. I think that is incredibly unfair for your side to just say that even if a minority tries really hard, there is not going to be any change in their lives, right? If you actually do follow the American dream and try hard, I do think that a lot of minorities are able to achieve certain level of success. I think that a lot of minorities are able to achieve a certain level, like to extend a higher quality of life, and especially considering that, for example, there's like more and more demand for social change, especially considering that there's more support for minorities, like examples like opening government's model. On motivation, why that is a good thing. From the past, when the American dream first became recognized all over the world, what it means to people differs vastly, right? To some it means freedom, to others it means being able to buy a good home and able to settle in with a family. But to all these people, the American dream had one thing in common, and that was it is a motivation to these people, right? We believe that especially in minorities, people need something to look forward to as motivation. Let's agree with opening government that is systematic racism. After the killing of George Floyd was caught and paid, and the world saw such police action, there were mass protests for BLM, right? It was not just Black people marching through, but it was people of all races. His killer was found guilty in a court. Like, this is justice. The American dream says to these minorities who are facing these injustices, if you work hard enough, you can obtain something better. What is a world without this motivation? Sure, there are still going to be things like affirmative action, but there isn't something that all minorities can unite with and pushes them to work hard, since if they work hard enough, they will get at least someplace better than they are in the status quo. We bite the bullet that the American dream may not be successful for all people at the end of the day. What the dream achieves is something more than financial gains. It provides minorities who need the motivation in crippling times the power to push past the blockades of the social system and the blockades of justice. At the end of the day, opening government and golf bench can't just claim that this hope is false, because even if that hope is false, insofar as minorities have hope and they're motivated to climb up the social ladder and in fact make a better role for their children and actually create social change, I think that that is totally fine. Opening opposition is the only side that gives you these benefits. Very proud to oppose.
Let me just start with rebuttals directly. Their argument was basically two things, motivation and role models. I'll rebut to both. But then starting with, they said that delusion doesn't matter because minorities are rational enough to know about their own abilities. So it won't be like perfection that they go for, and they would set their own standards of success. What are the problems with this? We believe that the societies initially pressure lead to these minorities trying to adhere to the American dream themselves, because in their case, minorities do buy things like American dreams. And if they think that their ability is big enough to achieve certain kind of positions, they would go for it, and they would do it regardless of any kind of like border considerations that they actually do have to care for. But then not only is this the case, but under their own characterization, let's talk about minorities who do have abilities, the minorities who are smart, but then do not simply have the resources to do so. We believe that they would rather think that they're able to achieve the greater than in fact the reality that they can only achieve. And when they fail with this, they actually have greater emotional harms, because they would think that it's themselves, the problem is within themselves. They're the odd ones who, even with the ability to do so, weren't able to achieve as much. You look at these are the exact type of scenarios we want to avoid, because it's constant harm to minorities who do not have anything else but abilities, and therefore is not something that we want to guarantee in a society which provides less opportunities for these individuals. Minorities go for goals that is more than what they can actually do. But then moving on, they also talk things about how we're also supporting meritocracy. The result of our side is all meritocracy for minorities, etc. Yes. If we talk about meritocracy, it means success accordingly to ability, right? We also support this model because we want minorities who have abilities to actually succeed. But we believe that that's impossible in the status quo for reasons like how minorities themselves are rejected by discriminations in the office work by applicants. And they also do not have the power to go in, top universities where success can be directly achieved and correlated to your opportunities. We believe that this itself is a direct problem that we want to solve. Now, how do we solve this exclusively unique to our side? We believe that now minorities get to look at other things like, what's the problem, the status quo? What's the problem that doesn't let me, flourish all these opportunities, even if if I do not have the ability? And they will look at all these kind of options that they can offer. Things like quotas, for example, they will try to look themselves for opportunities. But more than that, we believe that society themselves will now be considering minorities as someone who actually needs more help. If they do, I recognize this problem. I'll be elaborating this in my third rebuttal. But then more than that, we believe that if meritocracy is actually what we want to do, if minorities with ability is actually what we want to do, we should rather focus on narratives that actually provide better, opportunities or resume services, for example, opportunities for these minorities, not things like creating a narrative that only harneshes and only blames on the minorities themselves for having all of these problems that the society and the government is actually, in fact, responsible for themselves. Moving on to the next rebuttal, we believe they also said things about how there are more role models and there will be less motivation for minorities to work and etc. Two things to say. One, these role models are set by privileged minorities themselves, rich Black people, for example, something majority of the minorities can't apply themselves and relate themselves to. So like the direction and like the route that these privileged minorities walk to become such a successful model in the society doesn't correlate with the traditional means of minorities who actually live in that society. And we think that this is a massive problem because this itself is a huge delusion that minorities won't be able to connect to in the first place. So it's not impactful to the minorities at all. The motivation so it's not inclusive to mutually both sides. But then we also believe that it's a further negative moral model in which minorities get to opt in for life options and life kind of taking decisions that actually harm them and are not, correlated to their own individual thinking. But then before moving on to my second POI.
Opening or closing?
Closing.
So it's your case that if minorities reject this narrative, suddenly racism can end since they realize it exists?
We believe that racism better end in our side when it's never addressed in their side. So, I just move into my second rebuttal because that was directly the point I was trying to talk about here, right? So we also do have to consider, more importantly, how society would react to this narrative. Society is also impacted by the American dream because they would think that the reason why minorities are poor, the reason why the minorities do not have enough of these kind of social opportunities is because they don't have enough abilities and they don't deserve that opportunities. We believe that this itself is false and something that we don't want to, admit in the first place because it's not the fault of the minorities and the abilities that they're not succeeding at the end of the day. We believe that there are more entrenched, deeper things like discrimination, things like racism for Black people, or things like, xenophobia for these kind of individuals who moved on from, US to other countries and etc. We also believe that these kind of the minorities are things we actually be solving the problem. But then the model in the ops case is something that disregards all of these considerations that society actually did consider in the status quo. We believe that, in fact, society would think that there's less need and responsibility to themselves to provide services, for example, and work for the greater lives of these minorities. The impacts are two things that we have already discussed in our second argument. Things like how there will be less likely for minorities to receive help and services from other people in the society and the state. How also success would be not likely happen for specific privileged minorities who do have ability. So at the end of the day, even if they do have success in their best case, it's only privileged to my small number of minorities who do have the ability. And these would mostly likely going to be rich minorities who did have, the option to, get education, etc. So we believe that at the end of the day, we believe that these kind of, very important considerations of the minority status and conditions are rejected by the state and the society. The state will also not care about services if the people didn't care, right? So these are very unilaterally the reasons as to why there's a strict problem that of ignorance in the opposition's case. And lastly, they also move on to things like examples of George Floyd, but then they're not related to the American dream itself, right? But the achievement of justice. We believe that these are very different things about how when people relate to things, because justice and like police brutality, these are something that the people were moved and they related themselves to. That was the exact reason why people actually tried to solve that problem and moved for that. We believe that this doesn't exist, especially for these kind of narratives, because now they don't look at all these cases. We believe that this narrative itself is extremely limited to privileged minorities in the United States at their best handed, and success won't only unilaterally coincide to ability in any of their cases, because things like university and assessments based on standardized tests are only beneficial to minorities who can afford this in their first handed. So we believe that yes, we admit success and opportunity is associated with ability, and even if minorities work, they may go achieve something better at the end. But then more than that, more importantly, is that the minorities are incapable of doing this in the status quo where nothing is looked at, no problems looked at, and the state doesn't really try at all of solving these problems. We don't understand why in any of your cases, state and the government and the society would have the incentive to actually help these minorities have a better quality of life, because they will only be looking at and blaming on their inability, and this might even further extend to more harms and more impacts for things like how minority themselves are innately some people who are less intellectual ability to do so. Because these are the problems we directly want to avoid in our government's case proud to propose.
Panel, the main problem with the proposition is a complete lack of a realistic counterfactual. Okay, so you live in a world of the most prosperous nations in the world and you are a minority. Things are not so perfect. Your opportunities are to work within the system and to create change or leave the system. Working within the system is how the opposition bench does it, to the beat of Beyonce and the Megan Thee Stallion, people who actually succeeded due to the American dream. And that's why we're so proud to oppose as the OG. First, how to rebuild, second, rebuttals, and finally, our extensions, how united minorities are stronger, and how we actually solve the problem and the main issue at hand in today's debate. Okay, first, we're rebuilding our case. We believe that there's 2 points at logic here. First, pressures and emotional harms. Even if the minorities can only achieve a small degree of success, that in of itself is a legacy. People in your community will remember you as somebody who went against discrimination and made your life better for your family. We don't see why here people will suddenly feel that and feel bad for yourselves because you're a community and you're like people who've all faced discriminatory actions together. So you will feel happy for each other, etc. I don't see why in the same harms we don't see why these same harms won't exist under their side, because if people don't even have hope in the first place, they're left with feeling that no matter how hard they try, they can't even climb up the social ladder. Second, people cannot easily relate. They talked about how people cannot easily relate to role models. Obama was not from a rich family, and this claim is just a generalization of all role models, not only African Americans, but even for people of other races, and respect people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. It is extremely demeaning for the government side to just undermine the legacy of these people. So quickly moving on to my rebuttals. First, when they talk about the time when people created the term American Dream was a different time. Yes, we understand that it was a different time for minorities, especially because they didn't have anything, panel. They didn't have famous minority celebrities like the first Black president and the first female vice president. And if in those times people believed in that dream and succeeded, we don't understand why we should just take the thing that actually helped them succeed in the past and throw that away, because we can already clearly see, even with more injustice in the past piled upon them, they actually succeeded with the American dream. So we should not throw this away, especially for minorities, like we already seen with examples like Beyonce and all that. Second, when they talk about how there's going to be less burdens for minorities to follow the narrow view of success, when we look over the idea of what the American dream is, under no definition does it say the narrow idea of what success is. And when they keep on repeating it from the first and second speaker, we clearly see that the government side and the opening government side do not understand what American dream is, and it's clearly talking about just the overall dream that like a lot of people have, which is like to get to live in like a penthouse and like a material dream, which is clearly different from American dream, because American dream is contrarily really different for person to person, especially for minorities who are going to probably look at and want something vastly smaller than what white American males want. So in this end, this is just going to be a big motivation for them, nothing less and nothing more. Second, third, they talked about how it's less likely for minorities to get support. People are not going to go around and walking around a badge saying I support the American dream, and suddenly people are going to like disingenuize them and like think that they're like, oh, they don't need help or etc. It's just an idea followed by people. So unless the OG wants minorities to give up on doing anything by themselves and continue to be poor, so that conservatives in the government will give them financial check for them to get them in a higher place in the social ladder, they have no reason to like say minorities should stop being motivated to work harder and to be better by themselves. Minorities will also still get all the ideas mentioned by the OG on our side, like welfares and affirmative action, especially because those are what stepping stones for what is achieving American dream. And when they also talk about how there's going to be less motivation, the prop case wants minorities to focus on hard work, but they want to give them affirmative action to get work. The obvious backlash you create is so clear. If you have the shop and you say that you have to hire someone that society says this is the kind of person that just can't work hard, but you need to hire him anyways, it's not just patronizing, but it undercuts the fight for fairness. And this paints minorities as weak as rather than empowers them for success. So at least they need the idea of American dream, so that even if they get backlash, they do not care because they're fighting for something that they desperately want. And they also finally talked about how racism, xenophobia, and all these things are the things that they are like wanting, and those are the things that are stopping minorities in the first place. Well, we don't let the perfection to be the enemy in the good here. If the proposition wants to say that the US has been racist, yes, we say that has happened and that is something that has happened. But even as far back as the abolitionist movement has to end slavery, you saw a majority of white people push to end such racist policies. Proposition needs to prove that they have a better alternative, and they do not. And both sides of the debate can also not stop all these things like xenophobia and racism. So unless the government bench has like a magical wand that can solve all these problems, so what can we actually still do to help these minorities? We also still have welfare on our side, so that's completely ruled out of the debate for the government side to say it's a counterfactual. So what are we doing? We're actually providing them an American dream that already proved successfully in the past that they have done something well, and it has proved even if it doesn't work for some people, it still provides a motivation that all people can have, and it unites them, which I'll further explain in my argument. But before moving on, I'd like to take a POI.
You keep acting like there's an incredibly nuanced American dream that nobody else knows about. So what then do you think is the likely American dream of minorities?
Well, again, like we talked about, it's a case-to-case person. So if you're like an Asian woman who just recently got into the United States, you can probably think that if they're like a really young kid who's like 16, they can probably think, oh, I want to go to like a good college. That could be the American dream for them. But if you're like a 70-year-old Black person, you can be like, oh, I want to like live with my family in a good house and live to the end of my days peacefully. An American dream is just something that can be different for every single person, like we're already explained over and over, and it's also in the info side. So we don't understand why they keep like pressuring us to give us like one example for what all minorities will have. But if we have to, I guess we could say that to be better in a place where even like everyone is like against them, like with due to like racism or etc., they can still stand up for themselves and have a good life. So my first extension, why united minorities stand stronger. We believe that the moment that some minorities would abandon the American dream is the moment minorities collectively have less power and the voice in the democratic American dream. So in essence, the props plan weakens the voice of minorities from the get-go. Moreover, it insults the strides of all previous achievements. To abandon the idea that you can't achieve success is to submit the idea that you cannot. Imagine if Rosa Parks was like, sure, I will go to the back of the bus because I just do what I'm told. No, she said it was her right to sit in the front of the bus. And even in action charge, the American dream, that the idea that there can be a better world is what pushes us forward. And this debate is not a clash of good and evil, but a clash of apathy and action. And the hope is necessary for us to success and what is to give. And that is why we're so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Honorable Chair, in the status quo, we see horrible violence toward Asians. We see insane prejudice about how they're submissive and obedient individuals, which are reflected on media, university applications, which means educational opportunity, and workplaces, which decreases their opportunity and access to the things that they should have been granted access to. We see woman hate crimes like the Me Too incident revealed abhorrent reality of US, how women are still experiencing gender discrimination. And then we also see Black people being killed by police because they're simply Black, because they seem dangerous, because they have higher possibility of doing wrong deeds. Honorable Chair, US is still unfair to a daily and life issue to the daily issues to life important issues such as like educational opportunities or work opportunities. We believe that there is a significant gap and significant level of discrimination that is harming the minority. And that's the reason why we want to wholly deny the assumption coming from governments, saying that we are actually progressing. And we think that even this assumption can be offensive to a lot of people. And because of these reasons, I'm more than prouder to propose to this motion and reject the narrative. So what is the purpose of this debate? Because it seemed a bit messy on the opening half of this debate. First of all, this debate should be about, under the specific context of US, which correctly represents minority. So which is like principally correct, fundamentally correct. And we want to see this debate in an angle of which is a right way of levying responsibility. So like we think that narrative of American Dream emphasizes individual responsibility about their success and failure. Rather, like rejecting this looks like emphasizing social responsibilities. For example, the systemic discrimination, or like how the prejudice, social atmosphere and prejudice has caused long harm toward the minorities. We think that putting more emphasis on such social aspects is how it looks like to reject the narrative of American Dream, which side opening government perhaps not very clearly identified. And the today's side opening opposition talks about how this is only about practicals. They don't care about the truth. But we think that this is also a principal debate. This is a debate about whether we can deceive people to only give them short-term hope, if that is totally not true, right? We think that this is immoral. But secondly, this debate is about the social impact. And I'm going to talk about harmonization. This is not simply about minorities, but we think that such narrative of emphasizing like societal problem actually increases understanding between different levels of society and different groups, which leads to better harmonization, better efficiency, and eventually a better society in the US. And our alternative is very simple. We reject this myth that is not true, because it's principally wrong and because it is offensive toward the minority. But secondly, we also want to find social reasons and go through like solving that. We're not saying that we're simply giving up and putting those people to do nothing. That is not true. We're actually wait a second, going more towards finding for social reasons and addressing that rather than focusing on individual responsibilities. Before yes. QI.
So if you saw a Black family in Disneyland, would you kick them out since such dreams are not for them in your world?
No, we're not going to kick them out because the dreams are not true. So we told you about what this debate really means. What does the narrative of American Dream means? We think that this is about levying responsibility, as we had told you again in the introduction. So it doesn't mean that individuals can do nothing, but it means that like the results of their failure and success in, for example, education or workplaces has a lot of societal factors that cause like effects, and also like mainly would be about disadvantages that like, such societal factors would have caused. We think that that is the focus. We're not simply like putting them down and making them to do nothing, discouraging them. That is a wrong way of framing this debate. So before moving to our team's two contribution, I'd like to briefly rebut because most of their cases were actually preempted by our angling, right? First of all, they discuss about how people will have no hope. They won't work, they will give up, but they fail to understand the nuance of this motion. We're not going to put them all down, but this is about asking more for social like reconstruction and societal level changes. That is what we aim for. And for example, like what they talked about, like free slavery and Rosa Parks going against like Black discrimination, we think that this is exactly what we're supporting for. We reject that like it is all the individual causes, because like, they are born as a slave, therefore like they should go through that process. We think that we reject that, and we want societal and systemic reform. That is what we're standing for. Therefore, their cases are actually backing up our case, right? So having briefly rebutted the previous speaker, I'd like to move on to our team's two contributions. First of all, about how under the context of US, what is a correct form of representation of what minorities are actually going through. Opening government merely touches upon the general difficulties of minority, which are like even quite irrelevant with this debate. I'm going to further specify what is happening in the US and why is that particularly important and why that makes American dream false. First of all is individualism, right? Which is against communitarianism. US is basically a country where they very emphasize individuals' work, individuals' responsibility. And we think that American dream over on top of this individualism culture is unethical but also dreadful because this is further pushing individual like responsibilities and blame for all circumstantial failures. This means that, for example, like if a person fails to get an educational opportunity because they're Black, then they're blamed of their individual circumstances, their individual lack of work, or maybe like lack of effort, lack of capacity. And this means that, first of all, this is like basically wrong. But secondly, furthermore, the impact of this is that there will be less incentive to have social reforms or like have social infrastructure or acknowledgement of the systemic problem, right? But secondly, furthermore, the context of US, we see financial vicious cycles. We see high living prices in terms of house, education, and living expenses. Also, we see a large gap between payments. This means that blue-collar jobs are paid way, way less than other jobs, which minorities mostly work on because of like outsourcing. Like even if like they have 2 to 3 jobs, they hardly make ends meet, right? And in the status quo, in such circumstances of the US, it's extremely hard to go up the social ladder. And thus, considering all these circumstances, this debate is very simple. Do we currently represent the circumstance with the narrative of the American dream? We don't. That's the reason why we should reject it. But moving on to the second point about harmonization. So if individuals become targets of blame, it does not only discourage, as what the opening sign, no thank you, said, but it also leads to hatred and segregation, right? This also leads to crimes toward unspecified public from the minority because minority feel like they aren't understood, like they feel like they are all blamed for the circumstantial reasons. We see a lot of crimes where like Black people or Asian people causes harm to like unspecified public because they feel like they're segregated and isolated from society. Without this and without understanding that there are circumstantial factors, we believe that there will be less social cost, more understanding and harmonization. And because of these principal and practical reasons, I'm more than proud to propose.
I think this debate became such a weird question. Is the American dream real or not? Or even an opening where they talked about, do minorities even feel racism or not? Instead of actually talking about what the rejection of this narrative does to real marginalized individuals in the real world. I think that we need to be more concrete without just saying that, oh, okay, suddenly if you know that you're facing racism will be solved. Because I think in my POI, when I asked if that was their case, then they just literally just agreed, right? Like if you then acknowledge that you are going through racism as a minority, then suddenly racism is solved. I think that we're coming from a CO will just be much better in terms of mechanisms and showing to you how our logic even works in the first place. But before that, let's just take down opening government, because opening government just assumes minorities just mindlessly follow things. They assume that these people are so brain dead that they do not feel pain. Like racism is not some fantasy thing that you feel, right? It is actual pain. If someone kicks you or if someone shouts a racial slur at you, those things are painful. So I don't understand why in society minorities will not understand how racism is real, or how how they're going to suddenly reject the idea that for example, I got kicked out of this job not because the person shouted a racial slur at me, just because I'm working just because I washed something wrong or did something wrong in the job, right? I think people aren't that stupid and people are rational and know that racism exists. But aside from that, I'll tell you the implications of this rebuttal later. But then I think that CG also somewhat rehashes their case, right? But it goes on to the same debate as opening. Is this dream real or not, without actually talking about the repercussions of what it means to reject a narrative this prominent, this beloved in this America, right? So what's our stance? We're going to be very clear with this, because accepting the American dream does not mean denying the existence of racism. We don't think that you saying that I want meritocracy to exist, or I believe that everyone should be able to work for the success that they want in their heads, means that you say that racism doesn't exist, right? I think that the American dream is something like a goal and a mantra, right? It is like something that America should be aiming for, not just like an assertion that this is happening right now. Instead, I think that minorities should use and utilize this powerful narrative as a tool to be able to end the racism or end the barriers for them to being able to actually have the American dream in their own lives. side, saying that I want and I believe in the American dream, so I deserve to get equal wage to be able to access that American dream, right? To be able to access that success that Americans have in those narratives, right? I think that's what it's like, what the likely comparative looks like on our side of the house. What's our extension? Why is this comparative likely to lead to a better quality of life for minorities in the US? Before I go on, Yapio,
You say you only support meritocracy, but not like understanding social factors. But meritocracy itself is putting responsibility and blame on individuals about the results and depreciating social barriers and circumstances.
okay, so basically what that did is not listen to my, like the entire thing I just told you, right? I think that meritocracy in terms of the American dream is somewhat of a goal rather than just an assertion that minorities tell themselves, I am not feeling racism right now. This is meritocracy, as they're literally like being shouted slurs at. Like, I don't think that is really the reality that we live in. I think a much more likely reality, or at least we have fiat to be able to say that this is the likely comparative, that they're likely to use this to be able to fight the racism that already exists in society. So just an extension that leads me to my two levels of extension. Firstly, why inherently it makes, like on an individual basis, why it's empowering for minorities to believe in these kinds of things. But secondly, why then is how does rejecting this narrative affect minorities? So first point, why is this on an individual basis able to empower minorities? Because what is the trauma that all of the minorities in the US usually go through? It is racism, right? It's believing that you are not American enough, because that's the inherent point of racism. Like, you shouldn't be in this country because you are not American. You shouldn't get the same wages I do because you are not as white as me. Things like that. So why is believing in the American dream a cathartic for them in the first place? Because I think that if you are able to say that you believe in the dream and you are a part of the dream, it means that you're able to assert your right to exist in America, right? To assert your right to be able to be a worker there, assert your right to be living there in the first place, right? Saying that I am an American and in the way that I am hardworking and fighting for the American dream, even if there are barriers that I'm going through. It is cathartic for these individuals to be able to combat what racists say when saying that they're not American in the first place, right? I think this is the way, because I think the comparative is that on government side, by rejecting this narrative, it is just another insistence of the idea that you are not like the same kind or the same level of being an American as you are, as other people are who are natives to America, right? For example, if you're a white person, like I think the idea here is that at the very least you make sure that you do not lock yourself out from that common spirit that a lot of Americans believe in the first place. The second level of this extension, how does rejecting this narrative actually affect minorities in the real world? Because what is likely to happen on government side when you reject this idea, right? It's not just something that's an internal thing that you just whispering to yourself, I reject the American dream. Like, it's something that you broadcast, right? It's something you put in hashtags, you tell other people, you tell other individuals. So this is the problem in the debate, because they assume minorities just exist in a vacuum and it doesn't hurt them, right? I think what they believe in, what they're going to campaign for in the future, is going to actually affect them in terms of how other people view them, right? So there are two likely scenarios. Number one, I think it's going to likely antagonize the rest of society, because when you say that you reject something so inherent about America, right? It's literally called American dream. If you say that you reject this idea, it just increases the rhetoric of racists to say that, oh, they are less American, right? You're hurting the main core of our identity. You are literally against all American values. But secondly, I think it also just confirms stereotypes in the first place, right? It seems that like minorities are just complaining about being lazy, and they're like just complaining about all these kinds of things by saying that the American dream isn't true. I think it confirms stereotypes like, for example, African American people are lazy. Those kinds of things I think are likely to happen on opposition side. The impact of this is simple. It means that government cannot win this debate because they just existed in a complete vacuum. But it also means that you cannot convince people the American dream is just a complete lie when it is inherent to the country and too ingrained in institutions. You don't have enough social mobility to take down these kinds of things. It means that you cannot convince people at the very top to give you affirmative action if they don't believe you deserve it. So why is this better on our side? 3 reasons. Number one, at least you can establish a common ground, right? You're both fighting for the same thing. But secondly, you incentivize them to listen to you in the first place. You care about the American dream, but you are unable able to access it. So that means that people are likely to listen to you, since you are also talking about something that they care about in the first place. But thirdly, I think it means that it's easier to relate to you in the first place, because even if white people cannot face racism, they can understand the pain of not being able to reach the American dream. Because if they love this dream, if they cherish it in their hearts, they'll see why you are angry that you cannot get to it. They'll see why you are angry that you cannot get that success that they can have. I think in the world that we live in today, you have to be able to use the things that the narratives you already have to be able to benefit the most vulnerable people in society. Thanks.
The American dream is an imaginary and utopian concept that invites people to it and claims to be inclusive to all. But behind the rosy image of the American dream hides a lie that in America it truly doesn't matter what the color of your skin is, your gender, or your background, and success is achievable by everyone. It's the same lie opposition bench has been telling you throughout the entire debate. This is a concept constructed and promoted by the individuals at the top of the hierarchy, whose only incentive is to retain their power at the expense of minorities who have been systemically abused by the system. Because listen to the rhetoric and language of opposition bench. If you get past the bluster of opposition, it ultimately comes down to the idea that minorities just need to try harder. A couple of minorities put this off before. Why can't you? Without recognizing that is precisely what they've been doing for centuries with no good enough change. We think it is morally abhorrent. We think minorities deserve better. We think they should reject the narrative of the American dream. One clarification at the top of my speech. Closing opposition does something interesting where they act like they have a bunch of unique content, but if you listen to what they're actually presented, it is either disingenuous or it is completely derivative of their opening. Note that the American dream is, no thank you, not that everyone should be able to do this. It is the belief that I can do this, as the info side explicitly tells you. Moving on to the first area of the debate I want to discuss on whether or not it is justified for society to promote the American dream as something realistic minorities should strive for. We would argue that minorities are limited and oppressed in society at every single level, and I don't think opposition bench wanted to engage with the actual context. It looks like at every level of education, Black Americans are paid less than their white counterparts. At the same time, Black Americans have unequal access to quality of life, so goods, education, health, safety, all of that means that economic success is not guaranteed to them. It looks like minorities living in regions that have been neglected by governments for decades, that are ridden with crime and poverty, which is why the African American is 8 times more likely to end up in jail in comparison to a white person. It looks like being discriminated during the job application, like we know from one of the previous motions. Even for the lucky ones who find a job, white employees almost always are almost always paid higher in comparison to their Black counterparts. Therefore, our principal claim was that given that such abuse is so prevalent and objective, it is morally abhorrent for the state and society to pretend like the fault falls to the minorities per the rhetoric of opposition and not a discriminatory system. It is precisely what allows for those very injustices to continue. We heard literally no response from the speaker before me. They've already boxed themselves out of the debate. Between opposition bench, however, I think opening was slightly more confused than closing, so we'll deal with them first. OO makes this weird claim where they keep asserting that minorities can define American dream any way they want. This makes no sense. Read the info slide carefully. Definitionally, the American dream refers to the upward mobility. So it's not just whatever you want it to be. The metric of assessing the American dream must still be a level of success that is ultimately defined by your relative position in society. No, thank you. They can't just reference non-existent notions of the American dream to squirm around the debate. But two, then they say, oh, but we're still giving minorities hope. Giving hope to them is what matters. And literally that is the extent of their analysis. But presumably, you are not giving anyone hope if they continue to question why their life isn't getting better, why they do not see changes happening in their lives. That momentary lie is likely to break them down in the long run with no significant change whatsoever. Closing says they can empower minorities by asserting their right to be there. But this isn't so much of a manifestation of the American dream as it is of the American flag. You can empower yourself by saying you belong, but that does not mean you need to tell yourself that I can succeed in this place when we've told you that narrative is objectively false. So closing falls into the exact same issue, no thank you, as their opening. We asked whether or not it is justified for privileged people to create a system where the vast majority of minorities cannot succeed, and when they inevitably fail, blame their failure on them instead of the discriminatory system. Their response is that, oh, but some of them succeed. But this misses the point. That is precisely what allows the privileged groups of people to pit the blame on minorities and say that they are the problems. They are the ones that are not working hard. And even if there's 1, 2 minorities who succeed, flukes in the system doesn't justify pretending that this is achievable to everyone. They still have not responded to that principal claim that Seoyoung presented to you. Before I move on to the second area of the debate, I'll take that point.
If the American dream is so bad for minorities, why is it that most immigrants in this century are not white?
I literally don't understand what the purpose of that POI is, because yes, there are immigrants that immigrate to the United States, but I don't think that means that all of them need to accept that the American dream is possible for them. I think the system is pretty bad for them. I gave you literally 7 structural reasons as to why they're being abused. Therefore, what we're saying is that we're trying to reform the system to make it better for minorities. You cannot reform the system when you have, your opposition stance of saying that everything is fine. But while we're on this topic, let's just move on to the second area of the debate on how you actually solve the issue, because the analysis that Seoyeon gave to you, and by the way, again, the previous speaker, no analysis whatsoever. I think it's a bit too late if the last speaker of the debate comes up and responds. Only when you view the situation objectively can you achieve practical change. The solution to a terrible situation is not imagining an unachievable counter narrative. The solution is taking the problem for what it is and recognizing that there are steps we can take to solve the problem. Because listen to the rhetoric of opposition bench. In opening, their case line is literally, oh, why can't minorities succeed? There is no issue. That is the definition of avoiding the problem. I think it's also funny that the speaker before me talks about affirmative action, because at the point in which you reject the American dream, nobody has a reason to see that you have a problem. To be clear, you can still be loyal to America and be a proud citizen, but you are appealing that you and your ancestors have been disenfranchised and you're looking for another way out. That cannot happen on opposition bench. Next, we told you minorities are the only actors who can do this. As we told you, there are structural reasons as to why the privileged have no incentive to change the way the status quo works, insofar as they have not provided us an alternative or a reason as to why this is not true. This means that, again, there is no alternative that they can have. Minorities just manifesting that this can be done or that they can be successful, when objectively there are structural reasons as to why the vast majority of minorities will never make it out of poverty. We told you that is something that is incredibly unjust. But also note that there's absolutely not 1 second of response to the extension that we provided you. Because when we told you that when you only focus on success stories and the context of individualism in the United States that Seoyoung told you about, that means that social harmonization will never happen. Therefore, all of these stuff opening opposition was talking about, minorities will bond together and find community, these are largely imaginary insofar as they're only able to focus on success stories. And for the vast majority of minorities who do not make it out of poverty, who do not make it out of discrimination, the obvious societal response to that is your fault. The American dream exists. You should have tried harder. For all these reasons, we're very happy to oppose.
I think the mere fact that minorities have been able to make it in the US is the most golden and true version of the American dream. Because when they succeed, despite these structural barriers, even in the smallest way, they are the manifestation of the American dream. 2 problems with the debate. 1, I think there was a very unclear stance from opening government, which bled into closing, right? Because they say that, oh, no, we're not just going to become complacent as minorities. We're not just going to stop working hard. But then they also don't provide a clarification as to what they actually do and what it looks like to refuse the American dream. But secondly, I think all teams were very unengaging. I think only Cara was able to sufficiently engage with the arguments of the other sides and was very charitable. Even if you don't believe this, I will be doing so in my speech. Few extraneous rebuttals before I begin with my issues. Firstly, I just want to point out that implementing any policies like better support for people of color is not mutually exclusive. In fact, I think it is even more likely to happen on our side of the house, because when minorities perpetuate the idea that they are deserving of all of these opportunities, that they work hard to get what they have, that means that they all the more should be given these opportunities. Because why would you make sure that, for example, Black people have spots in a college when these people are just there because they're minorities, right? We think that these minorities, when they actively prove that they work hard enough to get what they deserve, will be able to get more opportunities. Secondly, I think it was a very lazy rebuttal from the previous speaker to just say we were reminiscent of opening when we told you things about the catharsis of these minorities when they're able to reject when they're able to embrace the American dream, how rejecting this narrative affects minorities, etc. No response to these things. But a clarification, I think Cara did rebut all of the logic given by the previous speaker, right? Because their logic is that if you don't view it objectively, you can't solve the issues of racism, which is the same logic as opening, where if you realize that racism exists, you can fix it. They're very reminiscent of their opening house. Meaning the debate is about how we tackle that racism, not in which side do minorities feel it. If they don't feel racism, why would we be here if they didn't call it out, right? 2 issues for you today. First, on where minorities are the most empowered, and secondly, on where they are able to succeed despite structural barriers. Why do we win over opening opposition? I think that opening opposition attempts to argue that minorities are going to work hard, and when they embrace the American dream, they are automatically going to succeed. But this argument cannot be credited because they never proved why it's true. Cara gave you multiple reasons for why this is true and why incentives exist. Firstly, that since minorities are aware of their oppression, I'll talk about this more later on, they can use it as a tool to propel themselves forward. Secondly, when minorities work hard despite their oppression, they show the United States that they deserve access to the American dream despite their identity, and we ought not to just reject the American dream and do nothing about the fact that we are facing these structural barriers. Third, that minorities obviously want to get out of oppression, therefore they will fight to succeed despite all these structural barriers that exist. And lastly, she showed you why people are more likely to listen when you embrace the dream, because you establish common ground and you give them something to care about. Why do we win over opening government? I think that when opening government says, oh, minorities are going to blame themselves for not succeeding, right? This is their strongest push. I think that everything was already sufficiently taken down by Cara. Two responses to this. Firstly, minorities are aware of the discrimination that they face simply because minorities aren't stupid. If they see that they're being denied these opportunities, even if they have the necessary qualifications, they'll know why. For example, if these minorities have sufficient credit but are denied loans, they'll know why. If a teacher repeatedly marks a person of color with low grades, even though they're doing everything right and like improving in the class, then they'll know why, because they're being discriminated against. Second response, here's what makes us unique from our opening house. Even in the worst case wherein this happens, why are we willing to accept that? Note that this is probably one of government's only strong points. I think that if minorities feel as though they are inadequate and subsequently work harder, we're fine with that because they can't give up since they need money, they need to survive, so they're likely to work harder. Like the analysis here that is unique to closing is that we told you that, okay, even if these minorities feel like they're incompetent, firstly, they're going to feel like that in your world anyway, because even if you tell them, oh, it's because you're Black, they're still going to feel like if they're denied an opportunity, they're going to remember that other people have been able to pursue it who don't look like them, and therefore they're going to think it is a matter of their own. Like it is the matter of their own. We think we have a better response to that on our side of the house. We think that only on our side are minorities able to directly combat racism. Because in status quo, the US provides minorities with opportunities simply on the basis that they are minorities. That's why people get to say things like, hey, like to the Black kid, you only got into Harvard because you're Black. We reject that idea. We think that minorities must work hard in order to prove to the United States that they deserve these spots that they have been given. Before I move on to why we win over closing government, yeah, I'll take your point of information.
Other than the fact that CO still has not touched our extension about why social harmonization never happens, why would privilege feel obliged to reform the system when the dominant narrative is that this dream can be achieved by everyone?
First of all, you just said, why would privileged people be like obliged to like change the system, whatever? I never said that. I think that minorities are systemically disenfranchised. They're not privileged. That's why they foremost are the ones who have the like urge to be able to change the system. Why do we win over closing government? I think the main push from closing government is that they want to fight racism, right? And you can't do that because there are structural barriers. No mechanization as to how they fix it anyway. I think the loudest way to fight racism is to disprove the very narratives which racism is based on. Because Black people ought to show the US that they're not lazy. Asians ought to show the United States that they can be more than a model minority. What government does is confirm these narratives and say, hey, they exist, we must give up. We think that protests are good, but minorities must fight in the real world in order to create real change. Second clash on where are minorities able to succeed despite structural barriers. Why do we win over opening opposition? I think that when they talk about how like this essentially improves the quality of life of minorities. Once again, there was absolutely no mechanization as to this, right? I think we told you, coming from Cara, that at its heart, the American dream says that if you work hard, you will get what you deserve. So, like, what is OG lacking? I think they refused to engage with government. I think they were very unrealistic, and a lot of unproven links were in their case. We're going to be directly rebutting the opposite houses and be more charitable. I think that government has a very skewed version of success because, yeah, it can mean becoming a CEO, but a lot of minorities, because of their disenfranchisement, cannot dream so big. What do they want to do? They want to start up their own businesses. They want to send their kids to a good school, right? So why do we win over opening government? When they tell you that only a small number of minorities succeed, I think this is false. But secondly, I don't think this material rebuts the idea that minorities must work harder in order to succeed. Because yeah, it's true that some minorities have an advantage, but this doesn't mean that other minorities cannot succeed. Why do we win over closing government? I think that when they talk about how, meritocracy is impossible because structural barriers have disallowed minorities from being able to become qualified, Cara told you that meritocracy is not something that we base our policy on, but it's something we aspire to. I think the American dream in the real world is a narrative we aim to achieve. Even if meritocracy is flawed in status quo, I don't think government has done anything to mitigate this. Because sure, the idea is flawed, but the goal is very real, right? Because they literally called successful minorities flukes in the system. Notice how this is literally just government trying to cop out because they say minorities can succeed, and when they do succeed, they're like, oh, it's a fluke, right? I think, in all honesty, government is very uncharitable. I think that, like, fundamentally, minorities must embrace the American dream, not the dream of a divided nation's forefathers, but the American dream of the parents who sailed across the sea for greener grass and hope, the American dream of their own. Thanks.